The salty morning breeze drifted in from the Atlantic as Eleanor pulled into her parents' driveway, her heart swelling with anticipation. Today wasn't just any day, it was the day she would finally take her parents on the dream vacation she had spent 2 years planning. As a marine biologist, Eleanor rarely had time for indulgences, but this trip was different. It was her way of showing gratitude to her parents for everything they had done, a way to give them a taste of the world outside their quiet coastal town in Maine. She had poured countless hours into researching five-star hotels, curating guided tours, and booking breathtaking experiences in Santorini, Greece. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from private sunset cruises to meals at the best seaside tavernas. As she parked, she glanced at the neatly printed itinerary resting in the passenger seat. She had envisioned this trip as a once-in-a-lifetime bonding experience, a chance to reconnect with her parents outside of holiday dinners and short weekend visits. Though the relationship had always been strained, with her younger sister, Rachel, effortlessly taking the spotlight, Eleanor had hoped this trip would be different. It was a chance to create memories together, to prove that despite their differences, she was still an important part of the family. Rachel, the family's golden child, was nothing like Eleanor. Where Eleanor was diligent, responsible, and financially independent, Rachel had spent her 20s bouncing between different jobs before landing as a social media influencer, using her charm and curated lifestyle to attract brand deals. Their parents, Marilyn and Richard, had always indulged her, brushing off her recklessness as youthful spontaneity while holding Eleanor to impossible standards. Still, Eleanor had spent years pushing aside resentment, focusing instead on carving out a successful career and creating opportunities for herself. Hopping out of the car, she adjusted her windbreaker and headed toward the front door, already picturing their excitement as she loaded their bags. She imagined her mom's delighted gasp at the luxury accommodations, her dad's awe at the crystal clear waters of the Aegean Sea. For the first time in years, she felt like she was about to be truly seen and appreciated. But as soon as the front door swung open, her mother's expression was strangely unreadable. Instead of grabbing her bags, Marilyn stepped onto the porch with a bright, almost forced smile. Behind her, dragging a sleek suitcase down the steps, was Rachel, dressed in an effortless travel ensemble, oversized sunglasses perched on her head. Eleanor's heart sank. Something was wrong. "Too late," her mother chirped, brushing past the tension already forming in the air. Eleanor blinked, confused. Rachel was holding luggage. Why would she have luggage? Her grip tightened around her car keys as her mind tried to make sense of the scene. Then her mother spoke again, her tone far too casual for what she was about to say. "Sweetheart, we decided Rachel should go instead of you. She really needs this trip." The words shattered Eleanor's expectations in an instant. Eleanor felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Rachel should go instead? The words rang in her ears, sharp and cruel, yet her mother said them so casually, as if swapping Eleanor out of her own carefully planned trip was nothing more than adjusting a dinner reservation. The shock left her momentarily speechless. Her eyes darted between her mother, who still wore that bright, artificially pleasant smile, and Rachel, who was now adjusting her sunglasses, the corners of her lips curling into a self-satisfied smirk. Eleanor's stomach twisted. This couldn't be happening. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor's voice came out hoarse, edged with disbelief. "I've spent 2 years planning this trip. I paid for everything." Her mother waved a dismissive hand, as though Eleanor had merely pointed out something trivial. "We're grateful, sweetheart, really. But you're always working, always so responsible. You can take another trip later." Rachel, on the other hand, has been so stressed lately. She really needs this. Rachel gave a dramatic sigh, shifting her weight onto one hip. "Oh, you have no idea, Elle. The last few months have been exhausting between content deadlines, brand partnerships, and managing my social media growth. I've barely had a moment to breathe." She placed a manicured hand on her chest, as if the very thought of her struggles weighed heavily on her. Then she grinned, the kind of smile she used in her Instagram stories, the one meant for an audience that adored her. "But, thanks to you, I finally get to relax. Seriously, you're the best." Eleanor felt her nails bite into her palm as she clenched her fists. The trip wasn't just a vacation. It was a gift she had worked relentlessly to afford. It wasn't Rachel's to take. It wasn't a spontaneous last-minute plan that could be rearranged to suit someone else's needs. It was hers. The realization stung deeper than she expected. Her father, Richard, stepped out of the house then, suitcase in hand, his expression unreadable. He avoided her gaze, his body language stiff with discomfort. He always stayed silent in moments like these, never wanting to take sides, but always allowing things to fall in Rachel's favor. Eleanor's chest tightened. He wasn't going to stand up for her. He never did. Dad? She turned to him, searching for something. Acknowledgement? Support? Anything? He hesitated, then exhaled, shaking his head slightly. It's just been decided. Eleanor. His words were quiet, but they hit like a slap. Eleanor could feel the heat rising to her face, her heart pounding as she struggled to contain the storm inside her. It had always been this way, hadn't it? Rachel got what she wanted, and Eleanor was expected to smile and accept it. She had spent years telling herself it didn't matter, that she was above their favoritism, that she didn't need their validation. But this? This was different. She swallowed the lump in her throat. So, that's it? Just like that? I'm being replaced on a trip I planned with my money, and none of you thought to tell me until now? Her mother sighed, her tone turning vaguely exasperated as if Eleanor was being unreasonable. Sweetheart, don't make a big deal out of this. It's just a vacation. We'll take another one someday. But Rachel really needs this right now. And I don't? Eleanor shot back, her voice sharper than before. Do you even hear yourselves? You're taking something I spent years planning and just handing it over to her like I don't even matter. Rachel rolls her eyes. Oh my God. Eleanor, relax. It's just a trip. Don't be so dramatic. I'll send you pics. Eleanor stared at them, at the people she had spent her entire life trying to impress, trying to earn a place with. It had all been for nothing. They had never truly valued her the way she had hoped. The truth settled over her, suffocating yet freeing in a way she hadn't expected. Her mother reached out to touch her arm, her voice softening. Eleanor, sweetheart, please. You've always been so understanding. We know you'll do the right thing. The right thing. She almost laughed. Of course, in their eyes, the right thing was sacrificing for Rachel. It always was. A cold calm washed over her, numbing the betrayal. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to swallow back the sting of rejection. If that's how they wanted to play it, fine. But they wouldn't be enjoying her generosity on her dime. Eleanor's lips curled into a tight, controlled smile. She nodded once and stepped past them toward the car. Let's get going then, she said, her voice flat. Her mother beamed, oblivious to the shift in Eleanor's demeanor. Rachel grinned, flipping her hair over one shoulder. Finally! I thought we'd never leave. Eleanor said nothing as she started the car, but in her mind, she was already making a plan. The drive to the airport was suffocating, the tension so thick it pressed down on Eleanor's chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Rachel, as expected, had filled the silence with self-absorbed chatter, flipping through her phone and rambling about all the must-visit spots she had seen in a TikTok travel guide. Mom, did you know there's a rooftop bar in Santorini with a waiting list 3 months long? Do you think we can get in? Maybe we can pull some strings when we get there. Rachel's voice was light, completely oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside Eleanor. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white as she stared straight ahead. They didn't even notice she wasn't part of their we anymore. Her mother, ever the enabler, chuckled softly. Oh, we'll figure it out when we get there, sweetheart. When we get there, the words landed like a blow. Not a single person in the car acknowledged the fact that Eleanor should have been part of that sentence. Not one. For years, Eleanor had been the fixer, the responsible one, the one who sacrificed her own needs to make sure everyone else was happy. Whenever Rachel needed something, their parents would bend over backward to provide, expecting Eleanor to do the same. It had been that way since childhood. Birthdays revolved around Rachel's preferences, family vacations were planned around Rachel's schedule, even holiday meals were adjusted to fit Rachel's diet trends of the moment. And Eleanor, she was expected to be grateful for whatever was left over. This trip had been different. Or so she had thought. It was supposed to be her moment. Her father cleared his throat from the passenger seat, his voice hesitant. Thank you for driving us, Eleanor. I know this probably feels unusual. Eleanor let out a short, bitter laugh. Unusual. That's an interesting way to put it, Dad. He didn't respond. He only shifted uncomfortably in his seat, probably regretting saying anything at all. Rachel, never one to read the room, leaned forward from the back seat, her voice grating. You're not mad, right? I mean, this is really big of you, letting me go. I could never afford this on my own. Eleanor felt her jaw tighten, her patience hanging by a thread. She forced a smile, though her stomach churned with resentment. Of course, Rachel. Enjoy the trip. By the time they pulled up to the airport drop-off zone, Eleanor's resolve had hardened into something icy and unbreakable. She stepped out to unload their luggage, her movements stiff but controlled. Her mother hugged her, the same patronizing warmth in her voice as always. Thank you for understanding, sweetheart. This means so much to us. And to Rachel. Rachel, dragging her suitcase toward the entrance, flashed Eleanor a dazzling grin. Thanks, sis. You're the best. Eleanor didn't respond. She just stood there, watching them disappear into the terminal, her chest tight with a mix of rage, hurt, and something else she couldn't quite name. As she climbed back into the driver's seat, she gripped the steering wheel so hard her fingers ached. Her mind raced, replaying every word, every smug look, every time she had been expected to sacrifice for someone else's convenience. Not this time. Eleanor pulled out her phone, her heart pounding with adrenaline. With a few quick swipes, she logged into her travel accounts. The hotel reservations? Canceled. The luxury tours? Refunded. The premium flight upgrades? Her inbox flooded with confirmation emails, each cancellation bringing a strange sense of relief. They wanted to take Rachel instead? Fine, but they wouldn't be enjoying five-star accommodations or private sunset cruises on her dime. Eleanor tossed her phone onto the passenger seat and exhaled. For the first time in years, she felt like she had control. The calls started the moment their flight landed in Greece. Eleanor had barely stepped into her house when her phone began buzzing relentlessly. She ignored the first few calls, then the next set of frantic messages that flooded her notifications one after another. She already knew what they were about. And she didn't care. Still, curiosity got the better of her. She finally picked up her phone and scrolled through the messages. Her mother's texts were the first to pop up. Eleanor, something is wrong with the hotel. They won't let us check in. Call me now. This isn't funny. The reservation is missing. Did you do something? Fix this immediately. Eleanor let out a slow breath, then clicked on Rachel's messages next. WTF, Eleanor, the hotel says there's no booking under our name. We're stranded at the front desk. You better call them and fix this now. This is so childish. Grow up and stop being bitter. Finally, her father had chimed in with a much shorter but no less accusatory message. Eleanor, we need to talk. This isn't right. Eleanor leaned back against her couch, staring at the screen, a quiet smirk forming on her lips. They actually thought she would fix it. After replacing her without hesitation, after dismissing her like she was an afterthought, they truly believed she would step in and save their trip. Not this time. She tossed her phone onto the coffee table and went to make herself a cup of tea, ignoring the continued buzzing. She moved through her house with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had been the one to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to sacrifice. Now she was simply letting them deal with the consequences of their choices. By the time she settled into her armchair with her tea, the phone had gone silent. A blissful quiet filled the room. She knew it wouldn't last, but for now, she let herself enjoy it. Later that evening, the calls started again. This time, she decided to answer. The moment she picked up, her mother's voice exploded through the speaker. Eleanor, what did you do? The hotel says the reservation was canceled and none of the tours are booked anymore. We are standing in the middle of Athens with nowhere to go. Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea before responding. I canceled them. Silence. A beat of stunned disbelief. Then a sharp inhale from her mother. Why would you do that? Eleanor let the weight of the question settle before she answered, her voice calm but firm. Maybe because you decided to take Rachel on my trip? You didn't think I'd still pay for it, did you? Her mother gasped, as if Eleanor had just said something outrageous. Eleanor, don't be ridiculous. We thought you'd understand. Understand? Eleanor let out a short laugh, shaking her head. You mean understand that my hard work doesn't matter? That I can spend years saving and planning something only to be tossed aside the moment Rachel wants it? Yeah, Mom, I understand perfectly. In the background, she heard Rachel's irritated voice. Mom, just hang up on her. She's being impossible. Eleanor could picture her sister rolling her eyes, probably fuming as she stood in the lobby of some mid-range hotel that was nowhere near the luxury resort she had expected. Her mother's tone turned sharper, more desperate. Eleanor, please, we are stranded here. We don't even have tours booked. The whole itinerary is gone. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, unfazed. Well, Mom, I guess you and Rachel will just have to figure it out. You made your decision. Now you can live with it. Eleanor. She didn't let her finish. She simply hung up. The calls continued the next morning, but Eleanor ignored them all. The messages piled up, each one more frantic than the last. Rachel, this is so petty. You're ruining everything. Just fix it already. Mom, your father and I are very disappointed. You don't do this to family. Dad, we need to talk. This isn't right, Eleanor. Eleanor set her phone down with a sigh, shaking her head. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the one who needed to fix everything. Instead, she felt something else. Relief. They wanted to replace her, fine, but they wouldn't be enjoying a dream vacation at her expense. Not anymore. For the first time in years, Eleanor was doing something entirely for herself. No compromises, no guilt, no obligations, just her and the open world ahead. A week after canceling her family's trip, she sat in the window seat of a flight bound for Santorini, Greece, watching the clouds stretch endlessly beneath her. The decision to book a solo trip had come suddenly, but as soon as she clicked the confirmation button, a rush of exhilaration flooded her. She wasn't running away, she was reclaiming the trip that was always meant to be hers. When she landed in Santorini, the sun was beginning to set, casting the island in hues of gold and pink. As Eleanor stepped out of the airport and took in the salty Mediterranean air, a new kind of freedom settled over her. No one to rush her, no one dictating where to go or what to do. This time, every choice was hers alone. The first night, she checked into a boutique hotel perched on the cliffs of Oya, overlooking the vast blue sea. The very same suite she had originally booked for her parents. The irony wasn't lost on her. As she stood on the private balcony, sipping a chilled glass of white wine, she imagined Rachel standing at some mediocre check-in desk back in Athens, fuming over her sudden downgrade. The thought made Eleanor smile, not out of malice, but out of a newfound realization. She wasn't responsible for their happiness anymore. The next morning, Eleanor set out to explore on her own terms. She wandered the whitewashed streets, stopping whenever something caught her eye. A charming bookshop tucked into an alleyway, a small cafe where the scent of fresh pastries and coffee drifted into the air. She spent hours meandering without a plan, something she had never been able to do while growing up in a family that dictated her every move. For lunch, she sat at a quiet seaside taverna, savoring every bite of freshly grilled seafood and lemon-infused olive oil. No one there to rush her, no one filling the silence with complaints or demands. She watched the waves lap against the shore, the gentle rhythm soothing in a way she hadn't realized she needed. By the third day, she signed up for a sunset sailing tour, something she had originally booked for her family but was now experiencing on her own. As the catamaran glided over the turquoise waters, the warm breeze playing with her hair, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of constantly proving herself, of seeking approval that never came, had begun to lift. A fellow traveler on the boat, an older woman named Isabel, struck up a conversation. "You're traveling alone?" she asked, sipping a glass of local rosé. Eleanor nodded, smiling for the first time without reservation. "Yeah, I am, and I love it," the woman chuckled. "Good for you. You'd be surprised how many people never have the courage to do that." That night, as Eleanor sat on the steps of a quiet Santorini village, watching the sky turn from orange to deep indigo, she realized something profound. She had spent her entire life waiting for her family to see her, to value her, but they never had. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't need them to anymore. The Eleanor who had arrived in Greece a few days ago was not the same woman sitting there now. She wasn't just traveling, she was transforming. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next, because now she knew she got to decide. Eleanor had been expecting this moment. She knew the second her family returned, there would be a reckoning, and she was ready for it. As she sat on the porch of her coastal home in Maine, sipping a steaming cup of coffee, she watched their taxi pull up in the driveway. They looked exhausted, sunburnt, and furious. Rachel was the first to step out, dramatically tossing her suitcase onto the pavement with a huff of irritation. Her mother followed, her face set in a tight, disapproving frown. Her father, as always, lingered behind, his expression unreadable. Rachel was the first to speak. "Well, I hope you're happy, Eleanor. You completely ruined our trip." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of her coffee before setting the mug down. "Ruined your trip? That's interesting. I don't remember planning a trip for you." Her mother's nostrils flared as she crossed her arms. "Don't start, Eleanor. You knew we couldn't afford to rebook everything at the last minute. We had to stay in budget hotels, take public transportation, and," she shuddered, "eat at whatever places we could find." Rachel groaned, rolling her eyes. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to show up at those luxury hotels, only to be told we had no reservation?" She gestured wildly. "I had to explain to my followers why we weren't at the places I had hyped up." Eleanor tilted her head, amused. "Oh, you mean you didn't tell them you stole the trip from me, that you weren't even supposed to be there?" Rachel's eyes darkened. "Oh my God, Eleanor, stop being so dramatic. It was just a trip. You could have let me have this one thing." Eleanor's smirk faded. She stood up slowly, her gaze sweeping over the three people who had taken her for granted for years. "One thing?" Her voice was calm but sharp. "You mean the trip I worked overtime for? The one I spent years saving for? The one that was supposed to be about me and my parents? That?" Her mother sighed, exasperated. "We just thought Rachel needed it more." "You're always so busy with work, Eleanor, we figured you wouldn't mind." Eleanor let out a short, bitter laugh. "And that's the problem, isn't it? You always assume I don't mind. You assume I'll step aside, that I'll sacrifice, that I'll make things easier for everyone else. But not this time." Her father, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. His voice was weary. "Eleanor, you didn't have to cancel everything. That was extreme." Eleanor's gaze snapped to him. "Why? Because for once you had to deal with the consequences of your actions?" She shook her head. "No, Dad. What was extreme was replacing me on my own trip. Like I didn't matter. You chose Rachel like you always do, and I chose to stop funding your favoritism." Rachel scoffed, crossing her arms. "God, you're so bitter. You ruined our vacation out of spite." Eleanor met her sister's glare head on. "No, Rachel, I took back what was mine. If you wanted a luxury trip, you should have paid for one yourself." Her mother opened her mouth to argue again, but Eleanor held up a hand. "I'm done. I'm done being the afterthought. If you want to talk to me, if you want to fix things, then show me that I matter. as much as Rachel. Until then, don't expect anything from me. Without another word, Eleanor grabbed her mug, turned on her heel, and walked inside, closing the door behind her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel guilty. She felt free. The silence that followed was unlike any Eleanor had ever known. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of disappointment and obligation, but one that felt light, liberating. For the first time in her life, she had set a boundary and kept it. No guilt, no second guessing, no scrambling to fix the mess her family had created. She had finally chosen herself, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had opened up. In the weeks that followed, her mother sent carefully worded texts, small attempts at reconciliation without ever admitting fault. Rachel remained bitter, her entitlement too deep-rooted to acknowledge the truth. Her father reached out once, saying he hoped they could talk. But Eleanor took her time. For the first time, she wasn't rushing to make peace for the sake of others. Instead, she focused on herself. She redecorated her home, replacing old hand-me-down furniture with pieces that reflected her personality, not her family's expectations. She reconnected with Maggie, spent weekends hiking along the Maine coastline, and enrolled in a marine photography class, a passion she had pushed aside for too long. And, most importantly, she started planning her next trip, one that no one else could take from her. One evening, as she sipped a glass of wine on her porch, watching the waves roll in, her phone buzzed again. A text from her mother. "We want to fix things." Eleanor stared at it for a long moment before setting her phone down with a small smile. If they truly wanted to fix things, they would have to do the work. For once, Eleanor wasn't the one holding everything together, and it felt incredible. The story of Eleanor is a powerful reminder that self-worth is not determined by how much we sacrifice for others. For years, Eleanor put her family's happiness above her own, believing that being the responsible one would eventually earn her love and recognition. But when she was pushed aside for her entitled sister, she realized something life-changing. Her effort and kindness would never be valued by people who only took her for granted. Her decision to cancel the trip and reclaim her independence wasn't about revenge. It was about setting boundaries and refusing to let others benefit from her hard work while disregarding her existence. Eleanor's journey teaches us that family does not excuse unfair treatment, and love should never come at the cost of self-respect. Sometimes standing up for yourself means walking away from those who refuse to see your worth. Eleanor's transformation shows that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. You can't pour from an empty cup, and you don't have to prove your value to people who refuse to acknowledge it. In the end, Eleanor found something far more valuable than family approval. She found freedom, and that's a lesson we all can learn from.